All right. First of all, thank you for being here so early in the morning, and thank you everyone for this very interesting conference with all your great talks, questions, discussions during the last few days. It's been an absolute joy, and it's been a really great learning experience as well. I work as a radio TV curator at the Royal Danish Library. I'll come back to the institution and our collections in a little bit. What I'll talk about today is AI metadata generation and how we can potentially use that as sort of a way to speed up how we give access to our collections. But before I start, I'll sort of try to narrow down the focus a little bit. What I'll actually be sort of doing today is taking you sort of with us on the journey that we're on, and we're at the very explorative stages. So I'll mainly be trying to sort of map out the landscape of questions that we've identified at our sort of at our early stages in this process. So rather than a lot of answers, we'll be sort of stepping up on our little hill and looking out over the landscape and sort of trying to map out all the questions we can see, all the things that we're going to have to investigate if we want to go or when we want to go forward with these projects. I'm also speaking as a curator from a curator's perspective, so I can see some of the technical questions, I can see some of the legal questions. I definitely can't answer them, but I'll try and map them out as well as I can spot them from my vantage point. The title sort of grandly says AI metadata generation. What I'll be focusing on is transcription, and more specifically is transcriptions using the Whisper model. So that should sort of narrow down the focus a little bit for you as well. All right. But what is it then that when we want to use technologies like this to speed up processes that we're already doing, what could help us achieve goals and go through tasks that we're already doing today? There's no doubt that AI can do many wonderful things that we weren't doing already because of various limitations, but can it speed up some of the processes that we already want to tackle today? That's what I'd like to try and figure out. All right, let's see. Right. So first of all, just to give you some context, my workplace is the Royal Danish Library. We're the national library and archive for cultural heritage, including digital cultural heritage, and we are the legal deposit institution for just about anything. Films go to the Danish Film Institute, but print media, CDs, DVDs, web archiving, radio, TV, ebooks, the rest of it comes to us. So and on top of that, we have the old collections of maps and manuscripts and whatnot. So it's a diverse sort of house and collections. Even within the department that I'm in, Digital Cultural Heritage, we take care of all the digitized and digital-born types of collections. So radio, TV is just one small corner of our sort of collected stuff. And just to give you sort of a sense of how we view ourselves and our role, what we'd like to do and who we'd like to be, in our mission statement, we say that we want to contribute to an enlightened and democratic knowledge-based society. We want to provide access to our collections for researchers, citizens, students, and companies. And we want to support our users in taking a critical view of knowledge and of data. So that sounds great and is clearly relevant in this sort of new reality with AI and potential access to lots more data. That should give you a sense of sort of where we're positioned and what we hope to contribute at least. I'll try to be brief about the collections. If anyone wants to know more about the collections, please come find me afterwards. But sort of in the very short overview is that since roughly the mid-80s, we've been collecting more or less, not entirely, but more or less full sort of broadcast flows from the public broadcasters and later on also the private broadcasters. We have selective samples of local radio and TV stations. So we have not a completely full, but a fairly good sort of comprehensive collection from the mid-80s going forward. Before the 80s, we have smaller collections that we've been lucky enough to have been that have been donated to us, things that people recorded, stored in their basement, and then at some point came and gave to us. And sort of the big shift in our archive is that from around 2005 onwards, we're receiving more or less everything digitally. So digital born from 2005 onwards, analog born physical carriers 2005 and backwards. And that's sort of the big shift or the big dimension that I'd want you to know about. Please come come later on and ask more questions if there's anything. So here's just an example of a workflow schedule. We don't have to go through this in any kind of detail. This is just for illustrative purposes. But what I'd want to tell you about here is that when we talk about the digital born collections that come in every day, we have more or less fully automated workflows. When something goes wrong, sort of knock on wood, there's a manual intervention, but otherwise things are relatively sort of self-monitoring. Of course, there's some quality checks, but otherwise things are pretty good. When we talk about the digital or the digitized collections, the workflows are almost entirely manual, and I think they're probably more manual than they ideally needed to be, and they're very labor-intensive. So just to give you a sense of what we do with the analog born material, we have the carriers digitized. We're in the process of digitizing more or less everything. Then we have the files. We need to listen through them, decide when does one program start, when does the next, when does one program end, when does the next start. Connect that up to metadata sources that we luckily have. Name the file so it fits our syntax, so it can go in the systems. Then another person takes over and uploads it into our metadata repository, and it goes into bit preservation. And then it eventually comes out in our Access platform. Same as the born digital stuff. The Access platform, just if anyone's interested, people can come and access in our, I think we have roughly 30 locations in-house, and we also have some partnerships with universities where their students and researchers can log in from home and access stuff. But otherwise, it's in-house only. But as you can hear, the manual workflows are very manual, very labor-intensive, and so far what we're doing is mainly processing requests. It's going to be very hard to do this on scale for all the radio TV collections from sort of 1980 going up to 2005 in any kind of reasonable time frame. So this is where we are starting to look into how could AI help us with some of this. All right. So as I said, we're at very explorative stages. We haven't been using AI to help us with these sorts of tasks. If we want to start thinking about, so we're newcomers. If we want to start thinking about how to do this, we thought a good way to start was to sort of test a little bit, get our hands dirty, and see what kind of questions does that raise. What should we be aware of? Which direction should we look in when we start exploring more? So we took what could best be described as a convenient sample, a small sample of radio programs from the 60s and 70s. We're already working on those manually. So some of them we've already identified, sort of what's on them, what metadata do they go with. Some of them we didn't know. We have these index cards that you can see that were typed up by the nice people in the 60s and 70s who recorded and donated the material. But for some of the programs, there's just no metadata available. So run this through speech to text, see what comes out, what kind of results do we get, are they usable, and in what way would they be usable if we wanted to speed up these manual processes for us. So basically very sort of open, explorative. What can we learn from this? What will this potentially help us with? And the results were fairly good. They're also a little bit mixed. I should say I'm definitely not a programmer. I'm at best sort of coding literate. And it took me a while to get it to stop translating all my transcripts into English. I think it was some kind of interaction thing going on with my OS. Switching to a different OS helped. But anyway, so I have some English language examples to show you, and that's nice. Here's a pretty good transcription of a poem. It's poetic language. That can be a little bit difficult, but overall it looks pretty good. Then we ran into the problem that I've heard that many of you have seen. When you try to run this in music, and this was classical music, just instrumental, no voice, it just hallucinates away. I've even cut it down for sort of to be able to present it in one page. This tells us something that I'm sure many people knew already, but we weren't aware of because we've only just started looking at this. So that'll be good. good to know moving forward. I'll try to sort of summarize the key learning points or questions that we're become aware of and where we sort of went from there after looking at these transcripts now. So the first point was we're definitely going to need more pre-processing than we sort of maybe initially naively hoped. We'd seen some examples where colleagues had taken current studio-recorded audio and run that through transcription, and it looked sort of perfect and almost ready to just put online tomorrow if our copyright lawyers would let us. And these results that you just saw show that there's a lot more work probably needed. We might need to downsample. We already have 3 copies of all our files for bit preservation. We have an extra copy for the presentation copy that goes out in the Access platform. We're going to need at least probably 1 more temporary copy for the to run through these models to do it efficiently. Because we're talking about digitized material, there's crosstalk on a lot of these recordings. So we have the tapes with recordings on both sides. They've been digitized at the same time. You can hear someone speaking backwards, sort of in the background, bleeding into the recordings. And because we're only now starting to think about access, we haven't edited that out of the files for preservation purposes. That's completely fine. For access purposes, maybe not so much. And for this sort of a poor transcription algorithm, that might be confusing as well. So there's something there to start thinking about. There's also something about whether we can use these sort of open off-the-shelf models. What we hear from the researchers is that they're best from speech data, sort of current speech data from the 2000s onwards. What we have here is ranging from potentially back to the 30s and up to the 80s, definitely well before 2000s. Is that going to work? We also have, as you saw, poetic language use, and the pronunciation in Danish has changed quite a bit in this time frame. So there's something to think about here at least. Hallucinations, as you saw, we're going to have to think about that, deal with that somehow. Maybe there's a way of, and I think someone mentioned tools that you can use to sort of have the algorithm just ignore when there's music going on. It's also possible that you could do something during post-processing, sort of flagging repetitions or something else. We also really should think about, and I've heard that echoed in a lot of other talks, what is it exactly that or how exactly do we want to use these transcripts? If we're allowed to, we could put them online for people to sort of search in and see. In that case, I don't know if our users are ready to sort of filter through hallucinations manually. But if we're just using it in search indexing, it's still going to create a lot of noise, but maybe it's not as bad as sort of overwhelming our users with these sort of noisy transcripts. So it gives us food for thought, and I think points us in some directions that we should think about further. So I've also tried sort of weighing what's the best balance of sort of effort and gains. And I think the most immediately applicable use case that I can see, at least for our department and our workflows, would be to stop cutting tapes into sort of program chunks and instead making slightly larger chunks available. This gives the user a little bit more work to do to sort of try and go and find their content, but we could maybe mitigate that by making those larger chunks searchable. Ideally, we would also be able to direct the user exactly to the point in the recording that they're looking for, and not just tell them this is 5 minutes in. Good luck. But that might mitigate some of the sort of extra costs that we're pushing onto the user. It would require changes to our data model, potentially some search tweaks to the way searching is done in our current archives, but sort of, it would save us a lot of manual work cutting the chunks into individual program sizes. So I think that's at least a very viable sort of way to at least investigate more. We also right now have sort of a growing bucket of programs or program fragments that we can't really make accessible to users. The big thing, or one of the things, is that our data model is really sort of very tightly tied up to a timeline. If we can't place it on the timeline, we don't have any reasonable place to put it in our systems. You can sort of like force force it into the system by making up a date or giving it sort of a pseudo date, but it's not very pretty, and we don't like to do it. So we need to tweak the data model first to do that in a reliable or in a good way. But even if we did that, we'd still just have pieces of audio that we could show the user and say, here's tape 479. We don't know what's on it. And speech-to-text transcriptions would help sort of tell the user what they're able to find. So I think that's a potential future use case that we should investigate as well. Say that we're not, that it's not feasible or turns out to be very useful for the user, or that we're not allowed to use the transcripts the way we want to, we could also work off of them and try to do some keyword generation, see if that would improve searches. And then you can imagine sort of even more optimized or even more sort of complex setups where maybe we could we have an open source or an on-site sort of non-scraping, non-invasive generative AI that we could show our metadata resources and show a transcript and have it sort of come up with some suggestions for what are the matches between what they say in this program and what you have in your metadata sources. That would be amazing. I think that's a little bit further ahead. There are a lot of ifs and buts, but something to think about anyway. Then we get to the legal considerations, and the lawyers are still out on this. From what we gather so far, there's some sort of there's some chance that transcription is going to be seen as an act of copying, and then we're going to be very restricted in what we're going to be able to do. It's sort of as if we're creating a new copy of their works. And do we have the right to do that? Do we have the right to distribute? We have the right to the one copy that we've already gotten, but we don't necessarily have the right to sort of make extra copies and do stuff with those. So we're waiting on the lawyers here. If it turns out that we're able to do something of some sort with these transcriptions, I think it's worth thinking about whether these transcriptions might help us in some other cases or some other areas where we're currently don't quite know what to do. And maybe you have this as well, these new-ish regulations about making content that you put online accessible to people with visual impairments, hearing impairments. Maybe this would be a tool that could help us with some of those considerations. And then there's maybe not so much a legal consideration, but there's a question of privacy. If we sort of more or less overnight could make our whole archive, or over a couple of months make our whole archive searchable, it's not just going to be public figures who are searchable in the archive. It's every stupid teenager who called their local radio station in the 90s and said dumb stuff. They're also going to be searchable in the archive. And maybe we are allowed to do that, but do we want to do it? I think there are some considerations there that we should definitely think about ahead of time. Good. So then the last sort of general point that I want to touch on is a theme that's also been touched quite heavily upon in the conference, and that's very important, and this is a question of transparency and integrity. And what is our role as archives and our role as the National Library and Archive? We basically want to preserve the integrity, not just of the collections, that's one important goal, but also the whole, the integrity of the whole sort of road from item in the collection to when it gets to the user. And if metadata is always sort of an intermediate layer, it's always like a layer, meta layer that people interact with to get to the collections, right? So that's nothing new here, but if we more or less overnight put in sort of a whole all-encompassing metadata layer over large swaths of the collection, and a metadata layer that might, if we're lucky or unlucky, look fairly sleek and sort of truthy to the end consumer, we have a role there in making sure that we're transparent about how we made this metadata layer, maybe even communicate it to the user somehow. I think with the old OCR, we have newspapers in one of our platforms as well, and the OCR is so bad that people can see sort of with the naked eye that this is a representation of the data. This is not one-to-one, just like a copy of the data. But if this looks as good as it sometimes does, and it still has biases and issues, we're going to need to think about whether and how we can make the users aware of that. On the other hand, as long as the archives aren't made accessible, or if they're made accessible with only minimal metadata, they're fairly inaccessible, and that's also not great for transparency and sort of access overall. So there's different perspectives to weigh out here. And then I think I'll end here and just sort of tag on to the second keynote yesterday, which talked about, could we as archives be sort of explorers of this new reality that we're in? And I think that's a very interesting possibility. And I think if we do that, we should make sure to take the users along for that journey. This is somewhat akin to when people started having to learn how to make an email account or Google things. People had completely fulfilling professional lives before that, but all of a sudden overnight they needed to learn all these new tools to be able to navigate their new everyday life. And maybe we have a role in taking users along with us for the technology sort of at large, but specifically teaching them how to navigate it within our resources and the collections that we make accessible to them. So I think I'll stop there, and then there should be time for some questions.
So questions. There's one over there.
Thank you very much. That was a brilliant presentation, very relevant for me at the National Library of Wales. My question is, you generating this AI data, where are you going to put it? Are you going to put it in your catalogue, or are you going to, where does this layer of metadata go? Because it's different to what's been produced by catalogers, isn't it?
Right. So right now it's not going anywhere. Partly because we don't know what we're allowed to do with it. Ideally, we would have to mesh it with the metadata posts that we already have in our archiving systems, and if we're allowed, push it out onto the access platforms. But we need to tweak the data model for our metadata schemas to fit it in. It's also possible that you could just have it in a separate index. If you just want to use it for searching and not for your archiving, you could do that. But we need to figure that out as well. It's a good question. I'll take it back with me. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I'm Tommy from the Finnish National Archives. I would like to know how are you now doing the quality control of the results of the transcribing? Are you doing it? Do you have some manually transcribed material, or do you do some statistical models?
Also a good question. We haven't actually sort of sat down to sort of transcript by transcript check the accuracy. It's just been sort of manual running through while we're listening. See, does this actually look good? So we're at such an early stage that we haven't figured out where we to implement this at scale, what we were going to do with it. And I think it also depends on how you want to use it. You could imagine if you wanted to be sort of an authoritative picture of what's in the actual file, you need some kind of manual quality control. If you just want to have it as a useful feature for people to search, then maybe you just put a disclaimer on and you say, this is better than nothing, this is better than it was before. Have a look. But this is a very good question. What is your aim with the transcription tab?
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. Regarding these hallucinations, have you thought about using the audience, the public, for like going through them and correct them? You know, this kind of Google check the traffic lights, mechanical Turks, so to say, things.
We've definitely talked about using crowdsourcing in other aspects as well. And this could be one. And I think there are other projects at the library where people have been able to correct markers on maps, and people seem to have enjoyed that a lot. So maybe there's a case for that. And if not for the hallucinations, then potentially marking where does a program start or stop, or some other metadata that could be useful for us and for other uses as well. So sure, that's a good idea.
Thanks.
Great presentation. My name is Göran Kostens from the National Library of Sweden. These considerations concerning transcripts and that you can find names and such, don't you have the same on newspapers when you are full text search on them? Is there any difference between the legal matters concerning newspapers or radio?
Good question. So right now we're only publicizing newspapers that are, I think there's some sort of operative guideline that's 140 years old, or 140 years old, I think. So that sort of helps us a little bit with that. It's going to have been a while ago that people said dumb stuff in the newspaper. But it's a good question. One of the reasons I think about it is we are doing web archiving as well. And we are absolutely not allowed to show the web archive to like almost anyone. There's about 4 people in Denmark who can watch the web archives or something like that. And that's because of all the personal information in there, right? And names are personal information, and addresses are personal information. And because of those problems, the stuff that people are going to, the stuff that we might have in the radio TV programs are going to be so potentially similar that we're going to need to have some thoughts about privacy and also some thoughts about the legal aspects. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Please an applause.